Hello friends, Jermaine here and welcome to this tutorial. So we're going to be looking at forms in Flutter and we'll be building this basic example. So this is a sign up form, which is pretty much similar to most sign up forms out there. We're taking a username and a password with a submit button here. So this also has got some basic validation. So when we hit submit, the error states flag up and then we see the snack bar with a error message on there. And if we go ahead and populate each of these fields, assuming they're all valid, we're able to submit it successfully. All right, let's begin. So we'll start with a material app widget. And in this material app widget, we'll have a scaffold widget. And in the scaffold widget, we'll have a padding, which is applied all across the screen. And then in there, we'll have our page form. So this page form is a stateful widget. It's able to hold stateful information and we're able to trigger stateful updates. So all our stateful information will go here and we'll be building our widgets and making stateful updates. So right now we're just rendering simple text, form goes here. So to implement a form, Flutter gives us a form widget, and this pretty much acts as a shell which would wrap our form fields. So this form also takes in a key. So this key will be a global key object. So let's define it here. And we want to cast it to what is known as form state. So what a global key does in the context of a form, it gives us access to all the fields we declare inside this form. And then it allows us to trigger certain actions across those fields. So for example, trigger validation on those form fields or trigger any save operations. And then we'll pass that here. And form takes in a child, and this child will be a form field. And the way we'll do that is by using the text form field widget class. And let's run this. Let's see what that looks like. This now gives us a form field which adopts the material design style. So you just see an underline. Also, we can adjust the design of this form field slightly. So we can set the decoration, and this takes in an input decoration. If I click on this, so if I click on input decoration and I look at the documentation, we can see the sort of options we can set for all of these. So for instance, we can set a border. Because I don't like this underline, I'll use an outline input border. So if I run this, it gives us an outline and some default padding also around this input field. We can also set certain options like label text. So our label text, in this case, we'll call it username. And should I run this, we get username as our label text. And once I click on it, it animates to the top left. So all of this is inheriting the material design guidelines. Of course, you can create your own custom form fields, but that is for a future tutorial. All right, so at this point, I'm going to add a button so that we can submit whatever we enter in this text form field. So to do that, I'm going to cut this, and for child, we will specify a column widget, which will allow us to define our fields as part of the children of this column. So I'm going to put this text form field and indent it a little bit. And then after this text form field, we will render a flat button. This will take a child. Then the child will be submit. We also need to specify a pressed event for this flat button. So if I run this, then you get this button here. Let's add some styling to this button. So we can specify a color and we'll give it blue. And we can make this text style as such. So let's give it a color of white, and let's give it a font weight of bold. So let's run this, and then we get that. Also, it'd be nice to add some spacing between the input field and the button. There's a tiny bit of spacing, but we can improve that a little bit. And we can use a sized box for that. And the height of the sized box will be set to 20. So if I run that, yeah, that gives it a bit more spacing. Next, I want us to look at how we'll handle the submission of this field. We can have an onSaved function for this text form field. And as an argument, we get the value of the form field. And here we deal with the value whichever way we want. So to do that, I'm going to persist this value as an instance property of this state object. So we'll create a variable called user as such. And then here on saved, we will set the user to whatever the value of this field is. And in order to, in fact, get this value set, what we need to do now is to use our form key. So here we can do form key. And then I mentioned we're able to access the current state of our form fields when we use a form key. So we'll do that. And then what we want to do is we can invoke certain methods. So we can invoke the save method, which will run the onSaved handler for each of our form fields that have been nested within a form. So in this case, let's do that. And then from there, I'll just print out user. So let me run this. And let's look at our console. So if I type in a username and I hit submit, we've assigned value to user, and now we're able to see it here when we print it out. So secondly, what I want us to look at is validation, because if this field is empty and we hit submit, we don't see anything here, although this is still being invoked. So the text form field also takes in a validator method. And in here, we can run validation on the input. So in this case, we'll say if the value is empty, then we want to return a string. And this string will say, please enter your username. And in the scenario where value is not empty, we just want to return null. Now, in order to run this validation function, we need to use our form key to do so. So the way we do that is by doing form key dot current state, and then we want to invoke the validate method. So invoking the validate method would go over each of our form fields, and then it will invoke this validator function. Also, running this returns a boolean. So let's say we can do, if that is true, then we'll run the save function, and then we can print out our user. So let's test this one out. So if we try to submit, we'll run this function, and then of course, because the field is empty, we are returning our validation error message. And which is why we see that over here. So if we populate this now with a username and we hit submit, it goes through and it shows up here. Presently, we are running validation only when this validate method is invoked. So that means in the scenario where there's an error, you notice when we fix that error, we still see the error state showing until you click submit, which will invoke this method again, and then the error disappears. So our form widget also takes in an auto validate setting where we can set it to true. And if I run this and we hear an error and we proceed to fix that error, you can see that the validation error state has now changed because that is set to true. So it will run every time essentially. Let's add a couple more fields. After our sized box widget, I'll add another text form field. And let's set this to password. We'll have an unsaved function and we'll have a validator function as well. And then next we are going to set our instance property to manage that, to hold that value. That'll be our password. So in here as well, we'll have a similar validation. If the value is empty, we'll just say, please enter your password, and we'll return null. So if I run this, we should have a similar field to the above. And you notice that this error validation runs immediately because we are setting it to true explicitly by default. So in fact, to resolve that, we can create a state property which will be assigned here. And then in the scenario where the validate method returns false, we'll do a set state, and then we'll set auto validate to true. So this means that we'll auto validate only after we've submitted at least once. So let me run this. And then we are getting an issue here, and I need to set the password variable to our value. Our auto validate property takes in a boolean, and at the moment it's set to null. So let's set that to false as our default, and that should fix it. Okay. And let's copy the sized box and bring it down here to add some spacing. As such. Anyway, so if I hit submit, it calls the validate functions of all our fields. And as we fix these validation problems, the error state should disappear. And also you would have noticed that for password, the fields are meant to be obfuscated or obscured, but at the moment they're not. So to do that is an option we can set for text form fields called obscure text, and we just set that to true. So if I run that now and I type in a password field, yeah, the text should now be obscured. Okay, and everything else should work as expected. Okay, so if I hit submit, we get our results logged out. Let's log out the password as well. Such, let's run and test this again. I'll hit submit. And when I populate this and submit it, then we get our name and password. So let's add another field to repeat our password. So you know when you're using your sign up forms and you enter in a password, or there's another field that is displayed asking you to repeat your password. So let's do something similar here, just to demonstrate how we can get multiple fields to communicate with each other. So we'll obscure the text, and then we'll say the label text will be repeat password. Let's create a field for our repeated password. I'll call it password repeat. And then we'll use these two methods. So unsaved, we'll set our password repeat to this value. Let me run this first before we get there. Okay, so we got our field to such, and that runs nicely. If I type in my name and I type in my password and hit submit, then it goes through. Let's log out our password repeat field. On successful submit, I'll open the console and let's sort out the validation for this field. And let's hit submit. And then we get our submitted values. However, the problem here is that the password repeat field does not match the password that was supplied here. So let's resolve that. We can retrieve the value of password and then we'll attempt to compare it to the value here. And if it doesn't match, we'll return this validation message, or else we'll return null. So let's give that a go and see what that gives us. So if I hit submit, we get that. And then let's see, enter that. And when I hit submit, we see that validation is still failing for the repeat password field, even though I've entered exactly the same password as this one, PASSWORD. And the problem here is because, well, let's try and log out password. So password value, password, and if I hit run, and let's try that. So our password value is null. Our password value is still giving us null. And at this point, it's null, which is because if we come back here, we are assigning this password value, the value to our password variable only when the unsaved handler is called. Now we are invoking this unsaved handler if our form is valid, which means that the password never gets set because this save function is nested within this if condition. So that means that this never runs, which is why we're always getting null. So alternatively, rather than waiting for the unsaved handler, we can have an unchanged handler instead, which in this case would mean that password is set every time we change the value of this form field. So if I run this now, and then we fix our validation, now the value is set for password, which means that we can match both of them now. So we hit submit, and now we've been able to submit our credentials. So let's tidy up the design a bit more. So although we're using sized box to add spacing between our fields, we can also use sized box to affect the size of any children widgets placed inside it. So we can have sized box as such, and then we'll set the width, and we'll say double.infinity. So that's essentially 100% width. And then we'll specify a child. This child will be our flat button. Then we can place that here, and then I'll adjust the indentation such, and then let's run this again. And now that makes it full width. And lastly, what I'm going to do is to add a logo. So here, Flutter ships their logo as part of the framework. So we can just do Flutter logo, and let's give it a size of 100. And we'll have another sized box with a height of, let's say, 40. And if I run this, we get something looking like that. And let's render a text widget that would say sign up. And we'll give this some styling. And for this styling, we'll set the font size to say 40, and let's set the text align to center. And we need to set this property to the text widget instead. So we'll set that here. Search, add a comma afterwards. And let's run this again. And we have a sign up link. We can set a color. And let's make the text slightly smaller. And we'll make the spacing slightly smaller here. And make it slightly bigger. So let's try that. And that gives us something like that. So let's try this one more time. And at this point, it should submit successfully. Okay, so let's do one last thing. I'm going to simplify this bit. Secondly, what I'll do is I'll use the snack bar widget to display validation error messages. So to use the snack bar, you want to use the scaffold of our current context, and then we can do show snack bar. So in here, we'll pass in a snack bar. We can specify a background color, and we'll just give a red accent color, and we can specify content for it. So this content will just be a text widget that says problem submitting form. And let's run this. So if I submit, we get the snack bar that will pop up for a couple of seconds and it will disappear. And then what we want to do is to display the same one for when we successfully submit our form. So in this case, we'll give it a green color and we'll say submitted successfully. And let's try that. So when we hit submit, we get an error. And if we insert the correct information, then it gives us a successful submit. And these are the credentials we entered into the form. Okay, at this point, I don't think there's much else. Best to remove the save function and change this to, rather than unsaved, we'll use unchanged, just to be consistent with the rest of the fields. We've done that here already, so we can do that here too. And let's run this one more time. And there's a print statement somewhere that I need to remove. Yeah, this bit. So let's run this one more time. So I hit submit, you get a problem, entering the correct details, and we should now be able to submit. All right, I'm going to leave it here. And this brings me to the end of the video. I hope you found this interesting, you learned something different. If you haven't subscribed, hit the subscribe button, and not only that, also hit the bell notification icon next to the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on any updates. Thank you.